everyone. Let's get started. Thank you for coming to the Center for Transformative Media, one of our events, a book talk from John Wihbey. I'm Adriana de Souza Silva. I'm the director of the center. And I just wanted to say a few words about the center and then introduce our speaker today. The Center for Transformative Media is Canada's interdisciplinary research hub dedicated to investigating the transformative potential of emerging media technologies, shaping grassroots creativity and promoting social change. We explored the many creative ways in which media technologies interact with societies. For example, how emerging media transform society, but also our creative potential to develop new media technologies, and how creative uses of technologies improve people's lives. Especially this year, we are focusing on this idea of AI as media, which means a cultural and a communicative force that shapes creativity, knowledge production, and civic life. And also how it transforms urban spaces, storytelling, journalism, community engagement, and society. There are many ways to be involved with the center. First of all, you can check our website. There's a QR code there. Sign up to our newsletter and social media channels, which you also can get on the website. If you're faculty in Kennedy or beyond, you can apply for center membership. Attend our bi-weekly brown bag lunches, which we have here at our center space, which is right there. And organize an event with us. We get proposals from our core and affiliated members all the time, and attend our events, such as this one here. These are just some of our other events for March. On Thursday, actually, me and my collaborator, Reagan Glover and Sutanuka, our PhD student, are giving a research jam about our project on retro mobile gaming project. It's the launch of our project. We have a physical collection too. On Thursday next week, we have a workshop with and a lecture with Jonah Brooker-Klein. And in April, we have another book talk from another center core faculty, Silke Meyer, and we have the last edition of our AI webinar series this spring, which is on AI influencers and the future of creator economy, which John Wihbey is also participating. So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker today. John Wihbey is an associate professor at Northeastern University, where he serves as director for administration and operations at the Institute for Information, the Internet, and Democracy, and director of the AI Media Strategies Lab. He's special advisor for strategic AI initiatives in the Office of the Chancellor, a faculty researcher at the Ethics Institute, and an affiliated associate professor in the Curie College of Computer Science. And I'm really interested in hear what you have to say about your book, so thank you.
Thank you. Should I hold this microphone as I speak? Screen, just forgetting. All right, well, thank you so much for coming out today. This is a really great event, and so many thanks to Adriana, to Evelyn, to Claire, and others who helped organize the event. I'm going to talk about a book that I wrote that came out last year. I wrote it substantially in 24, 25, so some of it is a little dated, and so what I'm going to do is talk about the book in a kind of condensed way, but then bring it up to date and talk about AI and social media, and so I'll kind of land there in the 30 or 40 minutes I'm going to talk. We will open it up for questions. You should absolutely feel free to get up and just get food and drinks, and I won't be offended at all. And I want to also say a little bit about the origins of the book. Books are a very, very long, intensive process, which can seem a little almost outdated in this day and age of like instant media and AI-generated media creation that happens at the speed of light. And it really does take kind of a village, and so the College of Arts, Media, and Design, which is my home college, has been incredibly supportive over the years in helping me pursue things that are a little bit outside of my lane. As a journalism studies scholar, I've sort of moved more into social media and platform studies. And folks like my chair, Jonathan Kaufman, my tenure mentor, Dan Kennedy, my good friend in the Dean's office, Brooke Wells, good collaborators like Meg Heckman and Mike Baudet have really been incredibly supportive over the years, and I'm just very grateful to you. Okay, on with Camdy Day talk. So the book is called Governing Babel, and if you are British, you pronounce it Babel. The subtitle is The Debate Over Social Media Platforms and Free Speech and What Comes Next. It is really a kind of narrative history of what we might think of as content moderation, which has gotten a lot of press in recent years and has become quite controversial. Both liberals and conservatives have kind of derided what the companies have done and their various policies and their various policy pivots, sometimes for good reason, and then sometimes, well, we'll talk about it. Really the research field as it stands is an emerging field. It's this field that thinks about things like the public interest, thinks about an informed citizenry, notions that are kind of imported over from old journalism and media studies, and thinks about like what is the public consuming and how is it affecting the population? Is it contributing to polarization? Is it contributing to an atmosphere of sort of hateful conduct or even violence? And so it's a really interdisciplinary field. It spans sociology, computational social science, journalism studies, media theory, comm studies. What I try to do in the book is I kind of dig into my old roots as an explanatory journalist, insofar as I'm translating a lot of work from a lot of other people, trying to stand on the shoulders of lots of giants. I also pipe in a bunch of survey research that I've done with folks like Mio Chung, Professor Mio Chung, and others around the university. And by the end, your publisher always tells you, even if you're doing narrative nonfiction, that you need to have some kind of argument. You can't just be on the one hand, on the other hand. So I do try to land an argument for a kind of new digital regulator. And I think this term is going to bubble up more and more. I was just at a meeting down in Washington with a bunch of folks who are thinking about how to make some reform around tech policy a centerpiece of the next presidential campaign. I think we haven't really seen anyone do that in a sort of central way. I think we may be getting to the point where society is ready to put down some light touch rules. Whether we're ready for a new agency or something like that, I don't know. In any case, it came out in October. And if you're wondering about like, what the heck is he talking about, Babel or Babel, it all seems confusing. And by the way, the word is from the Hebrew to confuse, Babel. The biblical story in Genesis is that there were a people and in a particular city who all spoke the same language, and because they could kind of all get along and have collective action and they all spoke the same language, they built a tower toward the heavens, and God saw that they were exerting or exhibiting hubris or ambition, and so he scattered them to speak many languages, and they stopped building the tower. And so the metaphor through the years, and I'll come back to it at the end too, but the metaphor through the years has captured the imagination of many media and communication scholars. There was a great book called A Tower in Babel, written in the 1960s by a scholar named Eric Barnow, which is the history of American broadcast. Jonathan Haidt, the professor who's talked a lot about digital safety, has written about it in The Atlantic. And this is from Bruegel in the 1500s. There were many Renaissance painters who were fascinated by this concept of Babel, communicative unity or disarray, collective action or confusion across our ability to connect with one another. And so you can see the cover art is kind of a little bit of a riff, thanks to MIT Press for a kind of light touch treatment. Okay, so here's what I am thinking about through the course of the book, and I'll give you kind of the meat of the book in just a second, but I'm really trying to think through the fact that we have the majority of the big tech platforms in the world having their HQ in California, and the 200 or so nations in the world having very different norms, cultural norms, very different laws, very different ways of understanding what is acceptable in terms of speech and expression and communication, and how those platforms have a kind of governing power across the world. And so the book in some ways tries to help us understand the cultural conflicts, the national conflicts, the ways in which norms on platforms are changing or eroding societal norms across the world, I think including in our own society. And so on the left here, we see sort of one new power center that's sprouting up, which is Europe and the European Commission and the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act and the EU AI Act. And so those are a couple of their policymakers there, Margarita Vestager, who were sort of there at the origin. And this is actually an old photo of Prime Minister Modi and Zuck, 2015, I believe. But many societies like India have massive amounts of usage of digital technologies from Meta across their platforms, and yet the policies that govern those platforms are not entirely satisfactory to the Indian government for a whole variety of reasons, and not satisfactory to civil society, the dissidents, the journalists, etc. So that's where I'm sort of headed here. The book has sort of four core chapters. So one is about disinformation. The next is about hate speech and human rights. The third is about incitement, so saying stuff that provokes people to commit unlawful action. And then the fourth is about AI and what I call epistemic risk. And epistemic risk is a kind of funky, wonky academic term, but I'll try to define it near the end. I start out the book, though, by saying, okay, here's sort of where we're at. In some ways, it's 2026, but we're really in 1996. And what happened in 1996 was we had the first update to our communications laws in the United States, really since the 1930s, when we set up the FCC, which governed TV and radio for many generations. And so in 1996, President Clinton, Vice President Gore, bipartisan Congress passed something called the Telecommunications Act. Within it, it had this little tiny provision that said, if you are an interactive website and you host user-generated content, you are not liable for hosting that user-generated content. And that was what was codified as Section 230. Almost no one paid attention to it at the time. Most of the force of the reforms under the Telecommunications Act around the internet were around basically a moral panic around whether children were going to be exposed to lots of bad stuff on the internet, and lo and behold, we were all exposed. And the courts threw out almost all of that language, but they left Section 230 in. And you may say, John, why is that important? Why do we care about this obscure law in 1996? It basically helped to structure and power the entire internet economy, whether it was Amazon or Yelp or Facebook or Reddit or any of the major platforms, because it gave the companies the ability to engage users at massive scale without any lawyers knocking on their door and suing them. Now, you can sue people for posting things about you for libel and whatnot, but you can't sue the companies under current law. And so 30 years later, we are still living with this doctrine, and people around the world are starting to not really like it that much. And so what's happening in Europe is they're starting to put laws on the books which kind of layer new obligations and restrictions on top of it. I have a bunch of other ideas up here, but I'm just going to kind of skip ahead because I want to keep things moving and get to the AI and social media stuff, which is, I know, maybe top of mind for a lot of you folks. Part of where we're also at is we continue to have these theatrical kind of grandstanding sessions where the tech CEOs are called before Congress, and there's sort of ducking and weaving, and there's lots of sound bites, but really nothing happens because we don't have a regulatory body that actually oversees any of the digital platforms in any substantive way. The FCC has a little bit of authority, the FTC has a little bit of authority, but essentially they are unregulated. So if you think about finance or healthcare or education or any of the other energy, any of the other regulated industries, they have to fill out paperwork, right? They have to show up to hearings. They have to have some amount of transparency, even if it's just to their own stockholders or whatnot. on a quarterly basis, on an annual basis. We just have nothing for these companies. And so part of what I'm going to argue is we need to make sure they fill out paperwork at a bare minimum. Okay, so what else is going on? I'm going to talk about disinformation in just a second, but let me just give you like a little bit more of a sense of like how this is playing out. So Tom Wheeler, who is the chair of the FCC under President Obama, who was helped me a little bit with the book and was kind enough to blurb it as well, has said in a book he recently wrote called Techlash, compared with the EU, UK, China, the United States is on the sidelines, watching while the race is on to develop national policies that will spread internationally by the same network that created the need for regulation in the first place. This is almost like a sort of national security framing in some ways. If the United States does not get its act together, everyone else around the world is going to proceed with their own sets of rules. And you may say, well, that's actually just and fair. The United States doesn't have necessarily a sort of moral superiority and or anything like that, and that's fine. But you have to also recognize that there are many, many authoritarian countries out there whose policies will be, I think, objectively bad if you value human rights and you value democracy. So there is peril right now by being so laissez-faire, sort of so libertarian about our tech policies. And so what Tom points out is that the U.S. is sort of losing its opportunity. Now you may say, if you are on the liberal side of things, this is the winter of your discontent, like content moderation is a lost game, the tech oligarchs are, have sort of taken over, but politics, the political pendulum swings, right? There will be policy-making moments that will come about in the next few years, and so the question for us, I think, as a society is, what would we want to stand up? Okay, so with that framing, I want to talk a little bit about disinformation. I'm just going to speed through these different areas. So on the left, we have British gunners in Holland fighting the Nazis, and if you look closely, those are actually not bullets, those are pamphlets and leaflets that they're firing. So you think about this coinage that we talk a lot about information warfare these days, and information warfare has been with us a very long time. For the better part of the 20th century, we talked a lot about propaganda, and which is actually, it's a very old word that goes back centuries. The Catholic Church used it to mean promoting the religious doctrine. Disinformation appears to be like a Soviet Stalinist coinage, kind of mid-century. There's this whole prehistory that I go through in what I call kind of the 100-year journey of thinking about media and communications in a modern mass media context. And so, if you read the book, there's some stories about, World War I, World War II. So for you history, geeks, hopefully there's something there for you. And I bring it all the way up to sort of current efforts to try to fight disinformation. So I interviewed some folks from Africa Check, which is one of the great fact-checking outlets in the world, and they are doing great work in South Africa and Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, and actually partnering with Meta and Facebook, or they were. I don't know where that stands because Meta has rolled back some of their policies, but they're doing things like this, which is to label false information and then try to get those labels out as far and wide as possible to try to tamp down on disinformation and propaganda. And so I sort of go back in history, I come forward in history, and of course, disinformation powered by generative AI has become really a vital force in many conflicts around the world. We've seen this in the Iran conflict, the Iran-US conflict, with all kinds of manipulated images and videos floating around. The Ukraine conflict, now 5 years old, has been suffused with disinformation and propaganda, primarily from the Russians, but certainly the Ukrainians have gotten good at it as well. And it's very much a live issue. Funny to think about, but the United States was actually one of the great kind of innovators in the creation of propaganda at scale. This is a great old World War I poster where the Creel Commission on Information was trying to rally the troops and get the American public behind the war effort in World War I. And it was really World War I where everyone realized that with the new industrial scale of communications technologies, radio was just coming about, but the ability to print things and disseminate things at scale, that this was really going to be like a successful strategy for many countries. The Nazis then took it to like a whole new level, obviously, in the 30s and 40s. I also go back to some like really old thinkers like Harold Lasswell, whose dissertation almost exactly 100 years ago, propaganda technique in the First World War, kind of first laid out some of the first like formal theories and ideas about what propaganda is and how to fight it. Let me just read something that he wrote in 1927, so 100 years ago exactly. And he said, to illuminate the mechanisms of propaganda is to reveal the secret springs of social action, and to expose to the most searching criticism our prevailing dogmas of sovereignty, of democracy, of honesty, and of the sanctity of individual opinion. Lasswell, by the way, came up with this idea during World War II. He was advising the White House that every time the Nazis said anything and tried to push propaganda to the Allies, there should be a plan of instant reply. And so that means if they have leaflets, then we should leaflet back. If there are column inches in a newspaper, we should dedicate that to a kind of counter speech. So he had this idea of counter speech and reply as deeply entrenched in the folkways of democracy. This is actually a very live debate. He also had weird ideas like, we maybe could let Mein Kampf circulate in American society, but if we let it circulate in American society, there should be pages that like oppose Mein Kampf within Mein Kampf. So it's like a very impractical scheme where we would just sort of label everything and we would go around putting metadata on things. And by the way, when I get to the AI and social media stuff, we're going to come right back to labeling and reply and counter speech. So these debates recur, I think, in interesting ways. And by the way, actually in a recent class I had, I've been teaching in the AI space, and we've actually had Meta's AI policy folks come into the classroom and talk with us and debate. And they have made some strategic decisions about how to label AI content. I guess I'll get into it a little bit right now just because it's just on my mind. But at first they were saying, things that are synthetic media are really sus, right? They're really not things that we want on the platform. The old Twitter was saying that. Everyone was like, oh no, synthetic media. This was just a few years ago. And now, like fast forward to this moment, like if you're a creator, there's like AI tools for you. You have like, create avatars, let's do digital twinning, let's just go wild with AI tools, and we see the slop phenomenon that's happening everywhere. So that the reason they made this shift from made with AI to AI info is because their creator community was complaining, basically, that like, hey, you're making all of our stuff look kind of suspect, and we're trying to make a side hustle living here, so we're just going to put this ambiguous AI info label. I assume lots of you have seen this on Instagram or other platforms. All right, we'll come back to labeling, as I said. The second big chapter is on hate speech and human rights. And here I go back to Eleanor Roosevelt, who is, I think, one of the great heroes of the book, and her efforts, which were just incredible, the diplomatic focus and energy she put into helping to create the Declaration of Human Rights, just an incredible feat, maybe unrivaled in the history of diplomacy. And she was really trying to carry forward her husband, FDR, the late FDR's legacy, and enshrine that in order to prevent another world war from happening. And one of the things that we kind of lose in this debate about like American free speech and sort of libertarian free speech maximalism, which is what people around the world think of America. Like you can just say anything, right? It doesn't matter. The listener doesn't matter. It's just the speaker's right. And so in that way, it seems like the First Amendment is sort of opposed to any kind of regulation or international human rights law that would limit hate speech. But Eleanor Roosevelt and a lot of the founding kind of thinkers around these doctrines actually thought of the First Amendment as a positive thing on the global stage. And so there's a whole argument in there, and this is a very active debate among legal scholars about the American First Amendment, international human rights law, shall the twain ever meet? Are they compatible? And there's lots of very generative thinking about new kinds of synthesis. I mean, in some societies, to use certain terms is a crime, right? And in other societies like ours, hate speech is actually constitutional, right? There may be restrictions on time, place, and manner, but it's basically allowed under our Constitution, under current jurisprudence. Here's the other thing. It will bring this back to the platforms now, and like how they are operationalizing various principles around speech and expression. What's interesting is that, I've dealt with Meta for many years. I know a lot of people there, and they often say, we are trying to use human rights law, international human rights law, and many of the principles enshrined in the UN Charter or enshrined in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is kind of the follow-up to the Declaration. We try to enshrine that in our policies when we do content moderation. And by the way, the amount of content moderation, the amount of posts taken down per quarter is just insane. Like if you go and you read the reports from TikTok, you read it from Meta, you read it from Google, we're talking about millions and millions and millions of posts, per quarter, per year. I mean, there's just, a lot of this is actually now being done by AI technologies, which are flagging these for their moderators. But there's just a huge amount of stuff being taken down. Back to these cross-national differences, if you go to like a notionally, geographically common space like East Asia, and you ask questions like, should people be allowed to speak their opinions publicly even if they upset other people, or would you favor harmony with others is more important than the right to speak one's opinion? If you ask that even in notionally some sort of common cultural regions, you get a lot of difference of opinion. And so if you're the Facebook, content policy manager, this is Pew Research data, by the way, but we collected some data that sort of points to this kind of thing as well. There are just lots of differences of opinion, and how you then operationalize what the rules should be in a particular country is really, really tricky. So I don't want to pretend that this is going to be an easy thing. Another one of the great heroes of the book is Maria Ressa. If you're a journalism student, you should know who Maria Ressa is, and the reason is because she won the Nobel Prize for Peace as a journalist, Philippines-based, American-educated, profound thinker and advocate who's going around the world giving talks about how the tech companies need to be more responsible. She very much thinks that they are inimical to journalism's mission of informing the public. You should read her or listen to her Nobel Prize acceptance speech. It's quite profound. And I'll just give you a taste of what she says in that acceptance speech. This is 2021. She's in our information ecosystem, and the world must act as it did after Hiroshima. Like that time, we need to create new institutions like the United Nations and new codes stating our values like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we just saw, to prevent humanity from doing its worst. It's an arms race in the information ecosystem. It's a great speech. So much, though, of what the platforms are dealing with is somewhat ambiguous. So I think we need to be real and clear about that. January 6th plays a prominent role in the book, not to dunk on President Trump and his allies, though there might be a little bit of that, but more to take a very hard-headed analytical look at the events that happened that day, and particularly what happened in digital space. How did the lack of content moderation, how did the lack of platform capacity, policy, effort, willingness to do anything contribute to an out-of-control situation? And in fact, in some ways that's slightly congenial to what President Trump would say about it, which is that things kind of got out of hand and I didn't mean for it to happen. I don't make that case per se, but I do point out that there were many, many policy decisions that were made by Twitter and Reddit and Gab and Parler and lots of other kinds of platforms over the months that preceded the January 6th events that I think were incredibly important. And I unpacked some, I sort of back in my journalism mode, sort of unpacked some documents that hadn't been unpacked as part of the congressional investigation about how platforms like Twitter really didn't have enough staff to deal with what went on that day. They the policy manager was on vacation, somebody was at a funeral, the person's covering for this other person, they don't actually have the algorithmic tools to kind of hunt down the people who are like literally live streaming, let's break into, Pelosi's office or whatever it is. And the violence that is, being effectively live streamed. It's kind of a domestic terrorist attack being live streamed. All of this is, arguably in violation of federal law, and Twitter just doesn't have the capacity to shut it down. So there's lots of stuff there that was generative for me, and thinking about, and I'll preview this, a kind of preparation standard that all the platforms should have. So this is the incitement chapter. Incitement, though, is so difficult because, incitement is often dog whistles, it's memes, it's ambiguously inciting language, it's coded incitement to violence, CIV is the term of art in the tech industry. Really tough to know what to do with it, but I have a bunch of ideas in there, and I even get into the debates over encryption, because a lot of the incitement that happens is through encrypted encrypted messaging applications, and there's actually some new thinking about what we could do about that. It seems insoluble as a problem, but there's some computer scientists who are thinking about things like message franking, where problematic messages within encrypted apps could at least be verified as having gone through the system. It's a little technical, but there's a bunch of stuff in there that's both like high policy, but also some technical details on incitement. All right, finally I'm going to get to AI, which is, I know, maybe that's the draw today. I'm not really sure. So if you were in Silicon Valley right now and you were part of the effective altruism community, or any of these communities that are really thinking about the future of AI, you would hear this term existential risk, right? And existential risk is really the sort of sci-fi vision of the killer robot, the kind of dramatic takeover of algocracy, or the Terminator or something like that. That's sort of what's in the mind's eye of the public. And what I try to say is, actually, I think maybe the risk, at least in the shorter term, is more epistemic. And epistemic is one of these fancy academic words, just means of or relating to the nature of knowledge. So epistemology is the study of knowledge, which philosophers would define as true verified belief, but we won't get into that too much. One thing I wonder about is, there was this old debate, for those of you who are fans of mid-20th century fiction, there was this debate between the people who thought the 1984 Orwell vision was going to be the dystopian future that would inevitably be forced upon us, and that's really the vision of 1984, which is a top-down, brutal surveillance state with the boot on the throat of humanity, and empowered by various kinds of technology. And then the other vision was the Aldous Huxley version, which is embodied in Brave New World. And here, I'll just put a finer point with an AI-generated image here. So on the left is Orwell, on the right is Huxley, and Huxley's Brave New World vision is we'll be kind of like lulled into passivity, and we'll sort of never notice that we've been effectively cognitively captured or something like that. But just to come back here, one of the things that I worry about with generative AI is that there is a certain kind of homogenization and a certain kind of mainstreaming of knowledge. Actually, for those of you who have searched on Google lately, you've seen those AI overviews, and you've probably noticed your behavior is something like, oh, these are kind of useful, and I'm not going to search the links as much as I used to. And a lot of publishing houses and publishers online are seeing like a lot less traffic. And so in some ways the AI is doing the knowledge work for us. And what I worry is that, this is a little technical, but in the distribution of data on any given subject, what the LLMs are often doing is focusing on the middle and not on the tails. And the tails are often marginal perspectives, sort of new interesting things, which aren't being rendered as prominently as some of the other mainstream stuff. And so long tail information being lost. I have a whole kind of riff that I can talk about on risk. The way that I think generative AI has come to the attention of the public as a media form, and this connects with what Adriana was saying is the theme of the center this year, is these sort of outrageous AI videos, which we kind of all maybe got fooled. I have a trampoline, by the way, and I've actually seen a squirrel on my trampoline, so I was like, maybe this was possible that like an animal would want to jump on a trampoline. I kind of wanted to believe it. But then, of course, we got to this kind of thing, right? And then we were like, okay, I get it. And now we see literally in the comment thread of every single thing that's posted online, like, is this AI? Is this AI? I think this is AI. And so it's become this like parlor game of like provenance and trying to think through like what's real and what's not. Let me just give a little bit of landscaping, and then I should finish up pretty shortly because I want to take questions. I'm sure you have some thoughts. So the landscape has become very thoroughly saturated. I would argue it's actually a kind of operating system now because it's really the infrastructure. On the content side, a huge portion of people's feeds is now AI generated, edited, or curated. The feed algorithms have moved away from what we would call the social graph, which is the stuff that our friends and neighbors and people we follow see, and more about your interest or content graph. I think this is very consequential. And AI features more and more as part of that. There has to be a tipping point at some point. People at Meta and TikTok and others right now are probably meeting, like, at what point does slop actually reduce engagement? Because people just think the platform is just like a bunch of junk. And clearly they haven't hit that tipping point yet, but there's been lots of news articles about them starting to get worried about that. But it's really it's a user experience, a UX of AI mediation. And you can think of it as like trivial animals jumping on trampolines, but we're starting to see all kinds of real world effects. This is a real BBC article where there was a fake bridge disaster, which then resulted in trains being canceled. But there's also lots of other more consequential things going on. I'll touch on those. There's all these new creator tools, and Camdy, we know many of these, I'm sure, whether it's Nano Bananas or Sora or Veo, all these high fidelity tools that allow for the creation of reels and TikToks and shorts and whatnot. I mentioned digital twinning, which is the idea that you create an avatar who can then run around the world in different language communities and different time zones and constantly give you a presence as a creator. All of these magic edit tools, native generation in AI, which Grok is really pushing. Importantly, a lot of the moderation functions, kind of getting back to the book here, a lot of the moderation functions are now thoroughly structured by AI. And so the whole thing is becoming like AI versus AI. AI systems analyzing all of the different kinds of content and context and trying to decipher coded language, often failing because the training data doesn't extend and overfits to the particular thing in question. There are all of these big efforts to do watermarking, because back to Laswell, maybe we should just like put like labels on this stuff so that people can have discernment, and hopefully they have enough media literacy to pay attention to the label. And there are great efforts like C2PA that are out there kind of globally trying to do this. There's also the ability to put digital stuff that you don't see, but that the systems recognize as a synthetic image or a doctored image. And increasingly we're seeing AI agents handle user reports. I predicted that the platforms will ultimately have lots of chat bots and mod bots, so chat moderator bots that sort of operate on top of LLMs and just kind of come in and talk to you about your bad behavior and give you a spanking or something like that. So what is everybody else doing across the world? Because everybody else is freaked out. The EU is adopting a transparency first model. They're saying, if they're deepfakes and they're trying to manipulate people and there's manipulated content, they have to be clearly labeled. China and India's rules are like kind of up in the air. They're a modification of their information technology rules. But China has this idea of a deep synthesis regulation, which requires visible labels. They have to be embedded. There's traceable metadata so the automated systems can pick them up. India is going to specify, if these rules pass, and forgive, I'm not current on what the state of debate is, the exact size and duration of the labels. Again, we're back to Laswell, like what should we do and how should we do it? The US states have gotten interested in criminalizing specific malicious uses, for example, of non-consensual intimate imagery, NCII. Amazingly, the United States actually passed some tech policy regulation called the Take It Down Act, pushed by the First Lady and the President and Senator Ted Cruz, and signed in with an overwhelming bipartisan support, which is about non-consensual intimate imagery, including classes of that kind of material that are AI generated. That's going into effect this year, but it's kind of a remarkable bipartisan consensus on like a little piece of tech policy and content moderation regulation. UK is kind of going its own direction with its various bills and policies targeting heinous abusers and fining them, so that's like another way of going about this. But there was a big philosophical divide about whether to regulate the content itself through transparency or to penalize people overall. Anyone see this in the Times recently? It's all these AI-generated kids videos that are completely illogical. Like they're like horses being born out of eggs, and like it's just, I mean, Professor Alper, I'm sure, has many thoughts on this as an expert in the field, at the intersection of this field. But yeah, there's just like lots of slop and garbage that kids are consuming, and you might say like, the EU and China and India and everybody's doing these different things, but what does it actually matter if we're like brainwashing our children into having strange beliefs about the origin of life and farms, and I don't know. But it was a quite entertaining and disturbing article about somebody who's just producing an enormous amount of slop for children. Newsflash, Meta just bought this social network. You may have heard about this social network, which is called the front page of the agent internet, called Moltbook. And Moltbook is an entire social network of only agents. So only AIs can participate. It's alleged that some humans are trying to spoof agents. The agents have created a new religion, apparently. They are participating in economic activity. There's all kinds of stuff going on. And then, the shoe drops. Meta purchases them. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'll be very interested to know what's going to happen. I mean, what do you do about that in terms of regulation? I don't know. Maybe I'll kind of wind up here with some media theory. And this is speculative, and I don't know if it's true, but if AI as media, or AI as a new operating system, or AI as a new paradigm, media paradigm, maybe on the same level as radio or television or internet or interactive web, maybe what we can imagine, and this is kind of a scary thought, is the public starts to care less about these labels. They start to care less about whether things are sus. They start to care less about like, well, the photo's manipulated, but it's interesting. And so this is, there's been a lot of media thinking over the generations. I was sort of drawing on some of this recently as I was trying to think through this. Maybe it kind of becomes structurally invisible. Maybe a new general purpose medium undergoes normalization. Media consumers start to apply emotional heuristics that they apply to real persons and situations, so they feel actual sadness, they feel actual empathy. When the first radio and TV technologies came out, some of these debates were actually pretty similar. Like, do we actually feel emotions when we see something on a screen? And lo and behold, the suspension of disbelief started to disappear. And so, I'm sort of predicting that a kind of critical vigilance might decay and that we may not care as a public as much, and here we go. Here, I'm just going to get to my final point, and then let's do questions. So I think it would be really a great public debate to have in 2028 whether we should have a new successor regulatory body to the FCC. And this is really what the book is about. I'm not a policy scholar, so I don't lay out like a treatise. I basically tell a bunch of stories in the book as a writer, explanatory journalist, where I try to kind of build up to like, what are the deep principles that we have had, that we've developed over the years, and how could a successor to the FCC, we're almost 100 years now past the formation of the FCC, it was 1934 actually, what could that look like? And my sense is that in the early years, we should do a lot of filling out paperwork or demanding paperwork to be filled out. We need to create some baselines. Every time people stand up and testify before Congress, they say a bunch of things. There's debate over what they say, and then there's a new news cycle and everybody forgets about it. We're not building an accumulated body of evidence of like, what are the harms? What's the evidence for lack of harms? We have lots of anecdotal information. As researchers, and this is sort of near and dear to the hearts of many here at Northeastern, including the new triple ID, the new Institute, as researchers, we just don't have access to the data. We cannot get platform data in a meaningful way. We used to have some access to the Twitter API. We used to be able to get more Reddit data. We used to be able to use CrowdTangle. All these things have been reduced or shut down. And so there are efforts to try to get disclosure and research access. I would like to see regular testimony. I'd love to see the first years of any kind of new digital regulator just building evidence, bodies of evidence that can be structured. There's no structure to our debate. And ultimately, you know, you're going to say, John, but how would you actually get the companies to do anything? And the one idea I've had, I've run it by a bunch of legal scholars, it would be unclear whether it would pass constitutional muster. But if you had a regulatory body, and let's say it empowered a citizens jury or a citizens assembly, it actually, you know, we do this with the FDA, where there are citizens panels and whatnot, where you have to kind of make a judgment call whether a platform is like getting stuff in line, right? Is the platform out of control, or is it kind of roughly doing its best in a topsy-turvy world? And let's say that the verdict was, it doesn't really have its act together right now. Things are kind of out of control on platform X. What if the sanction, right? What if the stick was that you had to pause user or an advertiser growth, right? Not content removal, right? Not censorship, as we've heard so much about. But what if you said, you know what, we're going to respect the speech rights of everybody on that platform, and we're going to respect the speech rights of the platform managers, and the Supreme Court has said, you know, recently, actually, in Moody versus Net Choice, that they do have expressive rights of a certain kind, not quite the same as newspapers, but you know, what if we said we're going to respect all those rights, everybody who's there, everybody who's managing it has that, but we're going to pause on adding any new users or any new advertisers until they get things kind of roughly back in line. I think that could possibly pass constitutional muster because it's not censorial, it's not content-based, it's a sort of broader judgment about the collective behavior of the platform. All right, just to finish, here are some more images of the Tower of Babel from the Renaissance. The Renaissance was like fascinated with this image. I showed you the Bruegel, but here are some more. And in a little authorial, fanciful phrase at one point I say in the book that there are now 7 platforms with more than 1 billion users across the world, and so we are, so to speak, building technological towers of a certain kind. And I'm sort of mixing the metaphor here. But I will stop at that and take questions. Dan, I'm just going to grab my drink.
Terrific talk, John. I'd like to go back to what you were talking about near the beginning of your talk, and which you do write about in your book, and that is thinking about Section 230. Now, I remember when it went into effect, and at that time, it was newspapers who were concerned about being liable for content in their comment section that was driving it as much as anything. There were no algorithmic social platforms at that time. So what I've always wondered about is why wouldn't the use of algorithms to favor some content over others be considered essentially publishing under the law so that you don't get this free pass from jail that you get with pure third-party commenters. Has there been any work on thinking about where algorithms fit into thinking about who's actually responsible for the content?
Yeah, and there were a couple terrorism-related cases, and I forget the names of them, but the suits were essentially like your algorithm promoted the cause of terrorism and then led to the, you know, some unfortunate event, which I think was like the death of someone. There was a couple cases around this, and so, but I think here's where things stand in my view. So this case Moody versus Net Choice, which basically took up the Texas and Florida laws, which the Texas and Florida laws were kind of Trump-inspired. It was like you can't censor anything on the platforms. It was sort of like a right to carry. And the platforms said, well, wait a minute, you know, we have we have expressive rights, we can moderate things, and we can algorithmically boost things as we see fit. Those went up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court said, you know, you can't tell the platforms what to do in this way. They actually have some rights. However, if you read the concurring opinions, this is where I think it gets really interesting, and this is where I think legal scholars are intrigued generally. The swing vote on the court is probably Justice Barrett, and I'm actually just going to read from her opinion. Because she has a concurring opinion. She sides with the social media companies that, like, yes, they can do what they want with algorithms, and they have a right to, you know, take things down if they want, or they think things are out of control. But she writes, but what if a platform's algorithm just presents automatically to each user whatever the algorithm thinks the user will like, e.g. content similar to posts with which the user previously engaged? The First Amendment implications of the Florida and Texas laws might be different for that kind of algorithm, so a kind of dumb algorithm. And what about AI, which is rapidly evolving? What if a platform's owners hand the reins to an AI tool and ask it simply to remove hateful content? If the AI relies on large language models to determine what is hateful and should be removed, has a human being with First Amendment rights made an inherently expressive choice, not to propound a particular point of view? So she's like grappling actively with like some of these ideas that like maybe as we sort of, I don't know, offload the moderation or the kind of cognitive human functions to algorithms, maybe we could start to see that as a kind of design infrastructure that is not necessarily a speech right, but is more of a regulation of conduct. And under American law, you can regulate conduct, you can't regulate speech. And that's like sort of a basic binary distinction. Barrett also says this. Oh, I've lost it. In any case, but she's interesting. Her mind is alive on these questions. And if she's the swing vote, I mean, I'll say this because you know it's totally off the record and this is not public. I mean, those were really dumb laws in Texas and Florida. They were like badly written and they were sort of incoherent. But if somebody came to the high court now with something more in the wheelhouse of what Barrett's thinking, it's possible that we could get some kind of nuance where. I mean, who knows? I mean, maybe they make up a new kind of framework for understanding what is a publisher and what's not. But I don't know. Do you have thoughts on where you would like this to go?
I've always kind of felt like you talked about some sort of a citizens panel.
Yeah.
I was thinking that if there could be some determination made that a platform is using its algorithm and being really irresponsible about it,
Yeah.
then maybe they should lose their Section 230 protection,
Yeah.
and they become liable for all the content
Yeah.
that they publish.
Yeah. John.
Yeah, so picking up on what Dan was saying, I mean, so I wonder if you look at what you lay out, which is fascinating, it feels like the two drivers right now are companies driven by profit
Yeah.
and governments like China driven by their own authoritarian impulses. And I think it's been, certainly for liberals, a wake-up call that, well, maybe you don't want more government regulation right now with a government as is already, you know, threatening journalists with treason and all this kind of stuff. So I'm wondering on the policy side, you're not a policy analyst, but, you know, stepping back, do you see another argument that Democrats or others could come up with that might be persuasive, that might say whether it's citizens, you know, that would be an argument that would say this is how we should move? Because it feels right now when you say just more regulation or a new FCC, you know, I sort of think, yeah, new FCC with everybody appointed by Trump, is that kind of what we want?
Right.
And I'm wondering if there's another alternative that draws on the history and says, well, here's another way to do it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Europeans, I think, are the pioneers here because they're basically keeping in place Section 230 and saying you can have what's called safe harbor. You can't get sued, but you have to meet certain criteria to keep that safe harbor, and that's exactly what Dan is saying. And so, but to get to your point, Jonathan, I mean, I think most legal scholars in the United States think that what the Europeans are doing would be illegal under the First Amendment. And obviously Congress and Jim Jordan and a lot of people have been very mad at the and J.D. Vance and Vice President J.D. Vance have been very mad at the Europeans for kind of imposing their standards on our tech companies, which are then through this what they call the Brussels effect, kind of backdooring censorship on Americans. So there's this whole debate, but I think like yes, probably the Digital Services Act in Europe would be unconstitutional in the United States. But the question is, could you pull pieces? You know, the transparency piece, I think, I think that's First Amendment compatible and respecting constitutional. And there's actually a very live bill that's trying to get, you know, researcher data access, more transparency, I think would be quite helpful. We see other experiments around the world that I think are just worth mentioning in terms of the context. I'm not sure I'm going to get your question head on, but like the Australians have decided that like youth harms are going to be like the central thing they're going to go after. And so they're restricting access to social media apps and doing, you know, sort of age gating, age verification and whatnot for folks under 16. We see other kinds of moves in Brazil and India, parts of Central Europe, which are kind of chipping away at what qualifies as safe harbor behavior. And so I wonder if there's going to be not like a single policy, but like a grab bag of different kinds of things: non-consensual, intimate imagery, CSAM, child sexual abuse material. You know, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of things that we can imagine. Like, first of all, those things are illegal under federal law, so the platforms already have an obligation. But the question is, what about the next set of things that are harmful? For example, like large amounts of hate speech that effectively push people to platform. And if we see the platforms as a kind of public accommodation, maybe that has a kind of civil rights dimension that could be undermine safe harbor for a company. I don't know if that makes sense. There may be other sort of slices where the companies lose safe harbor because they haven't done enough to police around a particular issue. Elections and public health would be the other places where you would obviously want to maybe think about some policies. But yeah, I'm not sure I have the solution, but yeah. Mike?
John, I'm curious, with all this going on, all this misinformation and slop,
Yeah.
how do you see journalism using AI in the next few years? What impact will AI have on journalism? Should it be not used? Should it be embraced?
Yeah, it's a great question. So you may remember my sort of tenure book, The Social Fact, has a whole chapter on where AI was supposed to go in journalism. And you know, the chapter is probably like at least half wrong, but you know, like that's what you do. It was published in 2019, and it seemed that at that time, like the big use cases in journalism were like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and ProPublica and the LA Times, like getting a hold of like massive amounts of data and documents, and then it was like prohibitively time intensive to go through it. So they would use machine learning algorithms to kind of parse stuff and find outliers and interesting little, you know, stories, and then they would go, you know, report them out with shoe leather. And that seemed like, oh, that's going to be the thing. And I think that's continued to be the thing. And AI obviously allows us to do like cluster analysis and topic modeling, all these wonderful ways of analyzing data and documents in these new ways. So I think that will continue. But the big thing, and this is what I didn't anticipate, is that we would have a general purpose technology, right? You know, and when GPT hit the consumer market in late 2022, I was like, oh shoot, I was completely wrong. I didn't realize that there could be a kind of general journalistic workflow where generative AI could touch many different points from beginning to end, hopefully always with humans in the loop. But I see increasingly a kind of divide. Many of the innovators in the space right now are really focusing on administrative data, public data, transcripts, stuff that you can kind of like vacuum up and then maybe spit out as automated stories. Obviously the AP and Bloomberg, and we actually had some Bloomberg folks come in and talk to us about their strategy with like securities reports and whatnot. It was pretty cool. But that stuff seems to me sort of lower hanging fruit, and maybe not necessarily the kinds of stories that are I mean, they're important, I'm sure. Like if you can produce a community newspaper that's accurate and use a lot of automated AI tools, like, you know, more power to you. I'm not sure anybody's going to get excited about those stories, because most of the stories in the world, the interesting stories, are in people's heads and you have to interview them. I don't think we want to forget that. the place that I think it can really help journalists, so the divide is, should we just do like, should we focus on automation technologies and see this as kind of like a scale play? Or should we see it rather as like as a technology that's going to empower us at certain points in the workflow, whether it's parsing large amounts of data and documents, or helping us organize how the work goes through a particular system and it then is published, whether, if we're doing a multi-platform strategy, I mean, you and I have talked about this a lot, Mike, like the same story needs to find its way onto different platforms to different kinds of audiences in different forms, in different modalities. And so AI, it does seem, can like help journalists with a task that's like really, in the old days would be very hard, right? To reskin it for video, to reskin it for audio, to reskin it, for pods and then for social, and then, that kind of stuff is actually really tough to do. But if you can keep accuracy and get it so that it is, multi-platform and multimodal, I think that's a really good use case. You do need human supervision though, and I know that's another thing we've been thinking a lot about. Do you have any? What's your number one use case?
I don't know, really. I mean, I feel like everyone's talking about it. All newsrooms are playing around with it. I do think, like, for multi-platform stuff, it's good as long as you have, like, someone looking at it. But I still feel dirty when you think about, like, as a journalist creating content using AI. It just doesn't feel right to me.
Yeah. Matt?
So
this is going to be a toughie, by the way.
so I just want to start with the idea of journalism for a second. So in this conversation that you just had, and then the expression about using AI for journalism is feeling yucky, it's a good example of the yuck factor. Like something morally doesn't feel right about using AI for journalism. Some threshold cross that that betrays the craft or the tradition or the norms or the values of journalism. And so in the way that you were talking, John, if there's like a value system behind the way you were talking, and most of the regulation over free speech, it's, John and I, we often talk about Michael Sandel, one of our favorite public philosophers. It's very much a utilitarian procedural liberal. It's almost completely dominated by utilitarian procedural liberal, rights-based vocabulary of values and trade-offs. And under those conditions, what happens is that either it becomes an endless debate over, who can amass the most amount of quote-unquote scientific research and data to demonstrate harm or cost. And as we know through all sorts of different types of other debates, that's going to be an endless debate where either side has equally qualified experts assembling, and we already see with social media and AI that those that are connected to industry end up with a different set of conclusions than those that are not, things like that. So just to step backwards, just to think about journalism as a craft, as a tradition, as a form of art, as something that you do because you're committed to it out of an intellectual passion. There's a difference between work and craft. There's a difference between work and vocation, right? So under those conditions, and oftentimes you'll hear like very famous journalists, right, say, I wrote this book because I wanted to understand this issue. Right? We write in order to understand, right? And so every time that we use AI to write something, we are doing so in the absence of knowledge. Because writing itself we can't really understand something unless we, sift through the literature, do a lot of on-the-ground observation and reporting, try to assemble and talk out in our idea how these different things fit together. Right? And then in the process of writing in multiple drafts and feedback from an editor, that's when we get closer to the truth of things, and that's where we get the enjoyment, the fulfillment, right? That's the values that we bring to this. So to me, it's like if you're going to, like, it's both an empirical question and also an important normative question. One is the analysis, and again, we've talked about this. It would be interesting to get some funding to look at and analyze the framing of regulation of AI generally leading up through this next election and the following election. And then look at the values-based arguments, the type of expertise that's being mobilized, right, across these different typologies and categories, the risks and benefits, the range of policy options. But then more fundamentally, how we use AI in the classroom, particularly when we're teaching writing or we're teaching journalism. right? I'm really concerned about the jump. It's like, we got to use these things, right? We got to get these tools into the classroom, right? It's like AI literacy and skill and everything like that, right? To me, it's just the next step in losing what education is really about, which is about, if creativity is anything, it's about the hard work of craft, right? And we lose knowledge, we lose creativity when we start to take these shortcuts. And we lose the depth of knowledge. Just give one last example. 2 generations ago, people that would be my grandfather, who were doing a PhD, when they learned statistics, they were using slide rules and pen and paper, and maybe they fed something through a supercomputer. Because it took so much time, right? And then when it came to the next generation who were using with software packages like STAT, the level of the older generation, their understanding of statistics was so much deeper and higher than even the best of the next generation. And now you're just feeding a data set into AI and getting a black box return of a regression analysis. It's insane. And you have to have 30 years of experience even to understand whether the output is wrong, and even what questions to ask of it, right? And so if we're jumping all those hoops, the next generation of students will know nothing.
A lot on the table. I think just one thing I wanted to say about the writing process. I think this is like, I'm on a task force and we're thinking a lot about that in the university. And there's a lot of really smart faculty who are trying to figure out how do we teach writing and how do we maintain standards and depth and all of that. And one philosophy is that we grade and evaluate and we focus much more on process. And there's a whole kind of evolving philosophy on how to do that. The English department's actually kind of in the lead on that. I'm really worried about it because it's sort of bread and butter to what we do in journalism too. And I don't have like an off-the-shelf solution, but I agree with you that writing is thinking, and the way that we get deep and we really wire not our neural pathways is to get really into the language and to really iterate and do drafts. And so I think that is an issue for the university that we're going to have to confront in a big way. And I think
you're using AI to summarize a long piece of text that you want to spend the time deeply absorbed in, and then you're taking those summaries and using AI to write something based on those summaries.
Do you think there's perhaps a difference between using, doing the journalistic writing for knowledge versus consumption? Because they're doing a lot of testing now, user testing. New York Times is doing it, where people actually prefer reading the AI write-ups to the human write-ups. Yeah. So there can still be like this process of writing for knowledge and using AI to write for consumption at the very end of it. Yeah. And the two things don't necessarily have to.
The question would be, why do they prefer that? Because it's easier, faster, and quicker? And is that a value as a choice as a society that we would encourage people to engage with the news even faster, quicker, right? Because there is, again, it goes back to first principles. What is the moral ecology around which we're trying to make decisions about these technologies and their governance? They're not tools, right? They have politics built into them. The value system of Silicon Valley is a very specific sort of deformed value system. If you look at the tech leaders and how they're talking about a singularity, I mean, you probably know the whole literature. So their value system is being imposed on the rest of society in the absence of any ability of participation in governance or anticipation of how these technologies are being built, which affects everything, right? They're not just tools.
I struggle between the poles of what you're saying and what Matt's saying. The thing is, I do think from like a media theoretical perspective, some of these things are just going to get sorted out in the kind of long accumulation of new experiences that then result in cultural norms about how we regard AI. Does AI just become a normal part, an invisible part of our sort of media, knowledge, informational life? And I think it's going to be a weird ride. That's all I can say. Maybe just a couple more questions, and right here and then in the back, and then we'll wrap up, and everyone should eat food.
Yeah, thank you for the talk.
Sure.
I think my question is you kind of mentioned that a little bit in your talk. Because we know, like, in academia, we do critical work, we just do such discussions and sharings about how what's AI's influence in the future in current society. But from the general public or the individual level, it's kind of like people are like, seems like the majority of the people are trying to embrace the AI because they feel like because of the efficiency first, or like the profit first society. So I was just wondering your insights about so for the general public level, how should we convey or communicate the harmful side of AI? And because like I saw many people are having the viewpoints about like this is a necessary thing, just as the invention of TV or invention of laptop.
Do you mean in education context or media
More like
context?
bringing like people's awareness about this.
About the downsides.
Yeah, and the difference between the previous technology inventions.
Yeah. That's a really interesting question to try to figure out, like, how do we articulate it as something qualitatively or order of magnitude different. I'll just take it maybe in two contexts. One's the learning context. So, the social scientists are all talking about cognitive offloading, or a kind of mental laxity that's induced. If you walk around Snell, I've heard students tell me this, like you look on all the screens, like you see GPT or Claude on like all the screens, and there will be effects over time. Now, one of the things that we're dealing with is a student population which is already brilliant. They've already, read Shakespeare and done calculus and all of that, or the cultural equivalent, because this is very early days. What happens when we introduce these technologies in 3rd grade and 4th grade and 5th grade? And, I see my children at home already starting to, use GPT for homework. And there's very little learning science yet, like hardcore empirical peer-reviewed learning science that can provide a basis for us to make judgments about when can generative AI technologies damage our learning and when can they benefit us and empower us and amplify our intelligence. So we just need a ton more research. I actually think Northeastern should be on it and be doing a lot of that research. And particularly because of our experiential commitments, like I actually think we can do novel research at scale. In the media context, that's where I'm worried, because just a few years ago, everyone said, oh, synthetic media, bad, and we're gonna have policies against it, and everyone's gonna point it out, and that was just a few years ago, and now suddenly we're like, actually, we're gonna give the creators like massive tools to just manipulate, reality in any way you want, and have, it's all fun and games, but now we see deep fakes, and we see, whether it's revenge porn or whether it's like open warfare in places like Iran and Ukraine, like we can see real damage. So I don't really have an answer there, but I do think the companies need to be more responsible. I think, we need to know more about what they're seeing and what they're doing about it. And I think that would be the beginning of a policy conversation. Last question in the back. Yeah, thank you. That was a good question.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to the overall debate between the kind of idea of like what is AI growing. And my kind of view that I always think is like, or I always think about is someone told me like Aristotle thought that writing was going to make everyone dumb because it's going to make their memories worse. And like with the idea now, AI is like I don't have a very positive outlook on the future with AI, just from the fact that it can replace most work in some ways. But how much do we really believe that we can, unless like there is like vast restrictions now, how much is that really going to become something that isn't just overall normalized? And immense effects of like these kind of like I believe there's been studies showing like these kind of content is addicting to like babies.
Yeah.
And how are these babies who are addicted to video going to be able to grow up and be able to write an article, even if it is a shorter article like a newspaper article, and even like worse than that, how they be able to write a research article that's multiple pages long if they're addicted, like physically addicted to media.
Let me make sure I understand your question. Can you just restate it a little bit?
So I was saying is how long before, like kind of like the overall general question, like how long before society normalizes all this content so much and AI usage so much that it becomes nothing different than like the iPhone or something now where we're suffering much more so from the consequences now. Because the consequences with AI is like seem a lot more far reaching than say like a book or like the phone.
Right. Yeah. In part because it could become so ubiquitous that, as I said, it mediates everything, and our initial preferences and the way we understand the world is all mediated by the technology. I think it might have been Socrates actually. Maybe was it Socrates?
Yeah,
It was
Socrates.
Socrates. Yeah. But I think that we are going to need to get some kind of guardrails in place, particularly for young people. And there's been this kind of like almost meme, which I think has a great degree of truth, which is that essentially, this is the new cigarette, right? And we've given it to a generation of students, younger students. If I poll my students, I don't know what you students would say to this, like, did your parents give you a phone too early? Like, pretty uniformly, they kind of say, yeah. I don't know if you'd agree, but there is a sense, I think, that we need to be much more intentional and deliberate about how we give technologies to young people before their, frontal lobe or whatever cortex is fully formed. My son is in 8th grade. He claims he was the last person to get an iPhone in his class of several hundred people in Andover, Mass.
That's propaganda.
So, yeah, what's that?
Propaganda.
Yeah, it's probably true.
Yeah.
But who knows? But regularly as parents, we see kids with like phones in 4th grade and 5th grade, and increasingly, they're going to Snap AI and GPT, and like their information world is increasingly being saturated by AI technologies. Now, I would argue that there's lots of other kinds of media on the phones that are, equally pernicious and we should be worried about. But I do think there's a synergy here that is potentially damaging. Expert Professor.
Well, just like
Alford,
that,
yeah.
like not to be too Marxist about it, but I feel like there is going to be even vaster inequalities as it relates to the ability to make informed judgments about information. That judgment is a spectrum, but the time that is more time with a human and less time with a human is going to be this broad differentiator of one's capacity to thrive in the world.
Yeah.
More than it already is. It's all just the widening of that.
That's profound, actually. And a good place to end. I actually really agree with that, and something to think about. Thank you so much. I'm really grateful, Adriana. I'm really grateful to Claire and Evelyn, and have a great day. If you want to get a book, it's over there.